Welcome and thank you for joining us for this lecture series on lessons not learned from the Holocaust. There are hundreds of you here. I'm sorry you can't see each other and I'm sorry we're not in person, but I promise we are in a community. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. My name is Mika Ahuvia, and I'm the Marcia and Jay Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies here at the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. As Curriculum Chair for Jewish Studies, I'm facilitating this series of events, which is also a 2-credit course here at UW. So behind the scenes of programming are dedicated professionals like Sarah Zadis-Rosen, Kara Schoonemaker, Emily Thompson, Lauren Kurland, and Rosa Lastly. My gratitude to them for their dedication in transitioning this lecture series online so seamlessly. Thank you also to our captioners, Myra and Sophia, for the live captions. This lecture series was made possible by the support and the partnership of Stephen Burrell. It was thanks to his intellectual curiosity and commitment to advancing the field of Holocaust education at the University of Washington that made him the perfect partner for this project. And at the beginning of the pandemic, it was Stephen who put his faith in the Stroum Center faculty and staff by giving us the flexibility and trusting us to move this course and event online. So thank you, Stephen, for your generosity. I also want to thank all of you who spontaneously donated to show us your support. We want to make thoughtful and critical educational programming free and accessible to all, and your donations make that a reality. So in order to keep the focus on the presentation, attendees in this Zoom webinar do not have video or microphone enabled. I welcome you to submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You will also find a closed caption button that you can use to switch captions on or off for this presentation as you prefer. Today's speaker is Dr. Nicolaas Barr. Dr. Barr is a graduate of UW's Comparative History of Ideas department. He received his PhD in history from UC Berkeley. He teaches for CHID, history, and Jewish studies. This winter, he will be teaching a quarter-long course on his very lecture topic, racism, anti-Semitism, and the lines of solidarity. So students, be on the lookout for that. Dr. Barr's pre-recorded presentation will be shown in this webinar without captions, and a link will be provided in the chat to a caption version now available on YouTube. We are recording this session and a video will be posted on the Stroum Center's YouTube channel in the next 1 to 2 days. So everyone that registered will receive an email with that link. The lecture today will be about 35 minutes. Then we'll take a very short break and then we'll take your questions in a Q&A box. Do stick around. I will always begin with a question from students in the course, but then I look forward to your questions and apologies in advance if I run out of time to answer your questions. Okay, let's get into this wonderful lecture.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Professor Ahuvia, for the introduction. I'm grateful to the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies for including me in this lecture series, and especially to its staff for the work of facilitating this lecture online. I should note from the outset that this presentation does include offensive racist content. I too would like to start by recognizing that I, and many of you, are living and working on the occupied homelands of the Coast Salish peoples. A land acknowledgement is important for all events sponsored by the University of Washington, but it is especially fitting for the course that I teach each autumn quarter on the topic of violence, contemporary thought, and historical memory. For although the topics that I'll be discussing today are situated elsewhere outside of the United States, one of the points I hope to emphasize is that the extreme mass violence of the Holocaust cannot be neatly isolated from other histories and ongoing practices of racial oppression. Like several other Stroum Center faculty giving lectures later in this series, I aim to expand the focus beyond the Holocaust in Europe itself in order to suggest lessons that may not have been learned, or rather have since been forgotten. The title of my lecture is intended to suggest that one of the lessons not adequately learned is the relationship between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, and that without understanding this relationship, we cannot grasp the full political and ethical significance of the Holocaust. In today's political climate, both anti-Semitism and other racisms are becoming increasingly visible, so it behooves us to understand how they are related. And in doing so, we are not comparing unrelated issues, but rather reconstructing a rich tradition of intellectual reflection on the nature of modern racism in its disparate forms. This comparative work has long been developed by scholars of color, such as Paul Gilroy, who points out that Black people, quote, have borne witness to Europe's failings, not just as colonized peoples in distant, conquered, and exploited lands, but at the other end of the imperial chain, inside Europe itself, as citizens, bystanders, and sojourners. For me, as someone who has studied the Holocaust primarily from the perspective of European intellectual history, there is much to learn from scholars and theorists whose work may not immediately come to mind when we think about Holocaust studies. In this lecture, we'll explore some of the theoretical responses to the Holocaust from both Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals, and especially Black intellectuals, whose analysis of racism can help us situate the Holocaust in a wider framework and better understand ongoing issues of anti-Semitism and racism today. I'll discuss three main topics. First, I'll examine the link between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in Nazi ideology. Second, I'll trace a few Black intellectual responses to European anti-Semitism, focusing especially on the Francophone thinker and revolutionary Frantz Fanon. And third, I'll consider mobilizations of Holocaust memory in solidarity with movements for racial justice today, looking at one recent example in the Netherlands. The Holocaust itself is one of the most intensively studied events in history, and all of us are, of course, familiar with the primary motivating force behind the Holocaust, the genocidal hatred of the Jews, as well as other, quote, undesirables, such as Sinti and Roma people, LGBTQ people, disabled people, and other victims. However, beyond this basic understanding, a lot of confusion reigns, especially about why the Nazis hated the Jews and others, as if anti-Semitism is simply a primordial, ahistorical, and unchanging prejudice. Much of the confusion, I think, stems from the fact that, at least in the contemporary United States, Jews are seen primarily as a religious minority, and therefore the Holocaust is seen as simply a culmination of the long tradition of religious Judeophobia that Professor Ahuvia detailed so effectively in her opening lecture. However, I would emphasize that while many tropes of traditional Christian anti-Judaism were incorporated into Nazi ideology, what drove the Nazi genocide was not religious intolerance, but rather an extreme form of modern biological racism, which pitted supposedly discrete racial groups against each other in a world historical struggle for survival and domination. In fact, the term Anti-Semitismus, coined by Wilhelm Marr in Germany in the late 1870s, sought to distinguish itself as a scientific outlook from common Judenhass, or traditional religious anti-Judaism. As Central and Western European Jews gained political emancipation over the course of the 19th century, it became politically useful to racialize the Jews as a biologically discrete population, an essentialized racial other, as a scapegoat for the increasing social tensions of capitalist modernity. In the aftermath of the destruction of World War I, the Jews, of course, played the central role in Nazi ideology and its vision of racial struggle. The Jews were viewed as a cunning, pathogenic, parasitical threat that had to be expunged from Germany and Europe, and later in the Holocaust, eliminated from the world. But other perceived racial threats also figured into the schema, including Black people, albeit in a different position of inferiority in the racial hierarchy. They too were demonized as a degraded people, but not seen as an organized, conspiratorial, internal alien threat at the root of Germany's misfortunes. While Jews and Black people figure differently in scale and position within the Nazi imagination, both groups were viewed as threats to German racial purity. Furthermore, they were seen as actively linked. Among the Jews' supposedly conspiratorial plans was an effort to increase the Black population in Germany, which was already present because of German colonialism in Africa, as part of the plan to undermine the nation from within. The European empires collided in World War I, and as part of the aftermath, Black French soldiers from colonies like Senegal helped occupy the Rhineland under the dictates of the Versailles Treaty. For the German political right, including the World War I veteran Adolf Hitler, this Black presence itself was taken as a gross affront. Even worse was that some Black soldiers had relationships and children with German women, supposedly weakening the German race through miscegenation. Just as right-wing Germans blamed the Jews for the German Empire's loss in World War I and for the punitive terms of the Versailles Treaty, they also viewed the presence of French colonial troops as part of a larger global Jewish conspiracy. Hitler thus wrote in Mein Kampf, quote, "The Jews had brought the Negroes into the Rhineland with the clear aim of ruining the hated white race by the necessarily resulting bastardization." Moreover, the Nazis perceived Black cultural influence as a major insidious threat. Some of you may be familiar with the term Entartete Kunst, the Nazi term for degenerate art. Jazz music was seen in these terms as well, and it too was seen as part of a Jewish conspiracy, as illustrated here by the Jewish Star of David pinned on the lapel of this racist caricature of a Black jazz musician. In addition to such explicit connections in Nazi ideology, many Black thinkers and observers noted the parallels between anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness long before the Nazi regime. Turning now to my second main topic, we can see that Black intellectuals grasped the underlying racial logic that underpinned both anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. In the early 20th century, African American intellectuals described the striking parallels between their own experience of anti-Black racism in the United States and those of Jews facing pogroms in Eastern Europe. Already in 1919, The Messenger, a socialist African American journal based in New York City, expressed its solidarity against anti-Semitic persecution abroad. Quote, "We wish to protest respectfully or otherwise against the pogroms being committed against the Jews in Poland or anywhere else. These pogroms against Jews are little different from the mob violence and lynching perpetrated upon Negroes." Such connections were made by African Americans during and after World War II as well. In a remarkable 1952 essay for the communist magazine Jewish Life, titled "The Negro in the Warsaw Ghetto," the great African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois described the effect on his thinking of visiting the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1949. Remarkably, after a lifetime of experience, he was already in his 80s, and half a century of groundbreaking scholarship, he remarked that this visit had dramatically changed his thinking about racism. Quote, "The result of these 3 visits to Europe, and particularly of my view of the Warsaw Ghetto, was not so much clearer understanding of the Jewish problem in the world, as it was a real and more complete understanding of the Negro problem. In the first place, the problem of slavery, emancipation, and caste in the United States was no longer in my mind a separate and unique thing, as I had so long conceived it. It was not even solely a matter of color and physical and racial characteristics, which was particularly a hard thing for me to learn, since for a lifetime, the color line had been a real and efficient cause of misery. The race problem in which I was interested cut across lines of color and physique and belief in status and was a matter of cultural patterns, perverted teaching, and human hate and prejudice, which reached all sorts of people and caused endless evil to all men." In other words, what he had famously called the problem of the color line in 1903 in The Souls of Black Folk had to be redefined. Understanding anti-Semitism gave a more complex picture of how beliefs about race structured cultural patterns, behaviors, and political economic systems, working differently depending on the context. Michael Rothberg, a Holocaust studies scholar from whom I've learned about this document, observes how remarkable it is that in the early 1950s, prior to the global institutionalization of Holocaust memory that began in the 1960s, Du Bois articulated both the specificity of the Holocaust and its relationship to other forms of racial domination, without collapsing one into the other. Rothberg coined the term multidirectional memory to conceptualize this relational understanding, one that preserves the differences among different forms of violence and oppression across time and space, rather than equating them. Such relational understanding is especially crucial when we consider the vastly different trajectories of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in the post-World War II period and the aftermath of the Holocaust. For just as the connections that I've touched upon suggest overlaps, there is a simultaneous risk of false equivalence or reductionism that conflates disparate forms of racism. If we understand racism as not simply an issue of personal bias, but rather as a system that differentiates and governs populations under different political, economic, and social conditions, then we see that often the often different function and effects of anti-Semitism in relation to other forms of racism, which is just as important as recognizing the overlaps. In order to explore this tension and the risks of false identification and equivalence, I'll turn now to the work of Frantz Fanon, another figure not typically associated with the analysis of anti-Semitism. Fanon is perhaps best known for his 1961 book, Wretched of the Earth, which outlined the ongoing revolutionary struggle against European colonialism and imperialism, and in particular, the cause of Algerian independence from France. Throughout much of his work, however, starting with his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, we also see a persistent interest in the persecution of the Jews and the ways in which it does and does not mirror his experience as a Black man and his struggle for freedom. What led Fanon to examine these connections between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism was a specific set of experiences and contexts, a process of disillusionment and alienation from the myth of formal equality under the French Republic. Fanon was born in 1925 to middle-class parents in the Caribbean island of Martinique, which was then a French colony and is now an overseas department of France. And his parents inculcated him with French education and Republican values. In 1940, when he was a teenager, the Nazis invaded and occupied northern France, and the French Navy, under the leadership of the collaborationist Vichy regime, arrived in Martinique. Outraged by the racism of the French sailors, as well as the discriminatory measures instituted by the Vichy government against the small number of Jews in Martinique, Fanon escaped to the nearby island of Dominica and joined the French Free Forces under the command of General Charles de Gaulle to fight against fascism. Up to this point, Fanon had thought of himself as essentially French, a citizen of the French Republic, an heir to French civilization, and more or less equal to any other Frenchman. What he soon discovered, however, was that the white French soldiers and later the liberated civilians in France did not see him, a Black man, as their equal. After the war, he received a scholarship to study dentistry in Paris, and in the colonial metropole, he again came up against the brutal reality of everyday French racism, revealing the hypocrisy of the French Republic's claims to the universalist values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. He soon switched academic paths to a specialization in psychiatry and forensics in Lyon, France's second largest city, and there his experiences of racism and psychiatric studies, combined with his immersion in the French intellectual culture of the immediate post-war period, led to his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, published in 1952, which remains a masterwork in the philosophical analysis of race. The central chapter, titled The Lived Experience of the Black Man, famously opens with the N-word and a white French child saying to his mother, "Look, a Negro." The quasi-anonymous Black narrator is not addressed by the child, but rather pointed at. The experience of being gazed upon and spoken about in this way utterly shatters the narrator's sense of selfhood, and the remainder of the chapter takes the reader along on an incisive account of racism's inscription in the consciousness and body of its victims. Through the shock of being pointed at by a child, this encounter with the overwhelming white world, the narrator is confronted with the experience of being turned into an object, fixed in place, gazed upon, and acted upon, and no longer a subject. According to Lewis Gordon, an Afro-Jewish philosopher and one of Fanon's leading interpreters, the rest of the chapter can be read as a series of failures by the Black narrator to reconstitute his shattered self, to realize himself as a subject and win recognition from the white world. The narrator tries multiple avenues, but all of them are denied to him. Assimilation, education, linguistic mastery, professional competence, by which he could supposedly claim his equal Frenchness, highlighting the grand achievements of African civilizations or offering cultural expressiveness and emotionality as ways to supplement or outdo the ideals of white society, exploding in sheer outrage at injustice. Nothing works. Having exhausted all of these possible avenues, Fanon's narrator is left shattered. Quote, "Not responsible for my acts, at the crossroads between nothingness and infinity, I begin to weep," the chapter concludes. It is a powerful indictment of racism, including well-meaning liberal racism, that remains all too relevant today. Whether Fanon's narrator calmly appeals to reason, to shared humanity, to principles of justice, or angrily calls out white hypocrisy, he is denied recognition. Strikingly, Fanon's chapter also draws attention to the connection between anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism. In the previous chapter of the book, Fanon describes the visceral impact that anti-Semitism had on him as a witness. Quote, "Colonial racism is no different from other racisms. Anti-Semitism cuts me to the quick. I get upset. A frightful rage makes me anemic. They are denying me the right to be a man. I cannot dissociate myself from the fate reserved for my brother." Here, Fanon takes on a sense of responsibility for those who suffer from other forms of racism, such as anti-Semitism, not out of a mere feeling of empathy or on the basis of abstract principles of justice, but rather from the conviction that his own selfhood is damaged and constricted by discrimination against the Jews. The reason Fanon cannot dissociate his own fate from the fate of the Jews seems to become clearer in the next chapter on the lived experience of the Black man. In explaining his perception of anti-Semitism in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the narrator suddenly recalls a lesson that was taught to him by his philosophy teacher at his lycée, or academic high school, in Martinique. Quote, "When you hear someone insulting the Jews, pay attention. He is talking about you." This is a powerful claim, but it requires some careful unpacking. First, it comes in the form of a recollection, a reminder from a teacher, suggesting that the point could easily be, or perhaps already has been, forgotten. The fact that one has learned an insight before does not mean that it will remain active in one's mind in all future situations. It must be sustained or reactivated. Second, the imperative form, pay attention, suggests that the point is not always obvious. The connection must be perceived below the surface. Racism may take the form of explicitly racist acts, like the boy pointing at him as an object, but it can also be masked or disguised by using others as a screen. Fanon's narrator feels called upon to actively recognize what is happening to others, even when it seems less visceral than the racism he faces. Finally, there is a moment of apparent identification with the victim. When the anti-Semite talks about the Jews, he is talking about him as a Black person. Fanon's powerful statement has been quoted more than once in recent years as commentators have tried to make sense of the alarming increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and Europe, alongside the growing visibility of state-sanctioned anti-Black violence, policing, and incarceration, and other forms of racism foregrounded by the Black Lives Matter movement. Some have quoted Fanon in order to highlight correctly that white supremacy undergirds both anti-Black racism and much of contemporary anti-Semitism. However, there is a severe risk of missing Fanon's point when this quote alone is taken out of the context of the essay. For racism against different groups plays out in different ways that cannot be substituted for one another. Immediately afterward, Fanon writes about his philosophy teacher's statement, quote, "And I believed at the time that he was universally right. meaning that I was responsible in my body and soul for the fate reserved for my brother, in other words, the Jewish victim of anti-Semitism. Since then, I have understood that what he meant quite simply was that the anti-Semite is inevitably a negrophobe. The implication is that the solidarity that he feels toward his brother in misfortune will not necessarily be reciprocated, even though it ought to be on the basis of shared opposition to injustice. Strictly speaking, Fanon's clarification suggests the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism only exists automatically at the level of the anti-Semite, who invariably hates both Jews and Black people. By contrast, solidarity against the anti-Semitic, anti-Black racist must be actively cultivated. It does not exist automatically. Why not? The threat to solidarity that Fanon identifies is the relative proximity to whiteness. Drawing extensively from the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre's analysis of anti-Semitism, Fanon shows how the racist visual gaze has a categorically different psychological and social effect on Black people. Quote, in Anti-Semite and Jew, Sartre writes, they, the Jews, have allowed themselves to be poisoned by the stereotype that others have of them, and they live in fear that their acts will correspond to this stereotype. We may say that their conduct is perpetually overdetermined from the inside. In other words, Jews have to deal with anti-Semitism, but they can choose to respond in different ways, depending on how much pushback they are willing to risk by standing out or fitting into the dominant white society. For Fanon, however, there is a stark contrast. Quote, the Jewishness of the Jew can go unnoticed. His acts and behavior are the determining factor. He is a white man, and apart from some debatable features, he can pass undetected. He belongs to the race that has never practiced cannibalism. But with me, things take on a new face. I'm not given a second chance. I am overdetermined from the outside. I am a slave not to the idea others have of me, but to my appearance. There are a number of points that we might question in the stark contrast that Fanon makes, as it is based on Sartre's own limited and somewhat problematic understanding of anti-Semitism. Significantly, not all Jews are white. Sartre's account was based largely on his familiarity with highly assimilated French Jews whom he knew personally, and whiteness is a historically shifting category. This is an enormous topic that I can only briefly mention here, but which we could revisit in the discussion. Moreover, religious observance and dress can visibly mark Jews of all ethnic backgrounds, and this factor has clearly played into incidents of anti-Semitic violence in recent years. Still, even with these caveats in mind, the primary contrast that Fanon makes is an important one. There's an element of inescapability of being a Black person in a predominantly white society. The potential basis for solidarity across these lines might exist, but one must be vigilant about assuming an identification with others and flattening out different forms and experiences of racism. Importantly, solidarity must not be made dependent on sameness or commonality with others, because we cannot presume to understand the experiences of others who are racialized in different ways, whose structural effects are also vastly different. In thinking about how these ideas bear on struggles against anti-Semitism and other racisms in the present, therefore, we have to be aware of how they function differently, rather than making simple analogies based on presumed identification with others. However, if we are cognizant of this potential pitfall, I think that we can find that there are possibilities for solidarity that can and should be developed. In the last part of my talk, I'd like to take up a recent example that shows how this can be done by forging lines of solidarity that extend from one historical experience toward the position of the other, while recognizing the distances that might remain. One of my areas of interest is contemporary Dutch society, for which the historical legacy of the Holocaust is a central issue. Every year on Remembrance Day, May 4th, a national moment of silence is held across the country, honoring those killed in World War II and murdered in the Holocaust. There's also an annual speech of commemoration, which was given in 2020 by the Dutch Jewish writer Arnon Grunberg. Grunberg born in 1971, is a playwright, novelist, and columnist who has written movingly about his originally German Jewish parents' history in the Holocaust. His mother was a survivor of Auschwitz, and his father survived the war in hiding. In his speech, he spoke primarily about the specific function that remembrance must have, so that it does not become mere empty ritual. Remembrance must involve confronting how the past makes us who we are in the present. However, there was one part of the speech that caught most of the attention and immediately created a storm of controversy. I'd like to play a brief video of this part of the speech, which is in Dutch with English subtitles.
Ik had toen niet gedacht dat ik een paar decennia later als columnist voor een Nederlandse krant een reeks onbeschaamd antisemitische e-mails zou krijgen. Ik dacht toen dat het taboe te groot was. Dat was naïef. En het is ook logisch dat als er gesproken wordt over bepaalde bevolkingsgroepen op een manier die doet denken aan de meest duistere periode uit de 20e eeuw, als dat gewoon is geworden, er vroeg of laat op die manier ook weer over Joden gesproken kan worden. Voor mij was het van het begin af aan duidelijk. Als ze het over Marokkanen hebben, dan hebben ze het over mij. Ik kan niet begrijpen, niet verdragen, dat men een mens beoordeelt niet naar wat hij is, maar naar de groep waar hij toevallig toe behoort, schreef Primo Levi in de jaren 60 aan zijn Duitse vertaler. Woorden die wij wekelijks, misschien wel dagelijks zouden moeten herhalen, al was het maar om ons aan te herinneren hoe giftig woorden kunnen zijn.
Grunberg did not reference Fanon, but I couldn't help but hear an echo of Fanon's words. If they are talking about Moroccans, then they are talking about me. Here, the positions that Fanon had ascribed to the Jewish person and the Black person are reversed. If one insults or stereotypes people of color, such as Moroccan Dutch people, then one is effectively speaking about me as a white Dutch Jewish person, Grunberg says. If it becomes permissible to talk in generalizations about the supposed Moroccan problem, as is now common in the Netherlands, then there's no reason that the Jewish problem will not be spoken about again. The underlying mechanism is the same, racializing or reducing individuals of a particular ethnic background to a single homogeneous group that must be excluded in order for the real national community to be restored to its supposed greatness. The lesson Grunberg draws from the Holocaust is the imperative to oppose this mechanism as it plays out in society, not just in extreme violence, but in its political manifestations and in its mundane everyday forms. Only by refusing this mechanism can the promise of solidarity that Fanon detailed be fulfilled. Grunberg here actively takes the side of his brother in misfortune, refusing to be used symbolically, as he later said, as a stick for beating other minority populations. Other Dutch minorities today face not genocide, but everyday structural forms of racism, which he does not face as a white Dutch Jewish person. Systemic discrimination in employment, housing, education, and policing. Grunberg's speech was not popular with many, especially with those on the right wing of Dutch politics, whose platforms consist significantly in the denigration of Dutch minorities. They accused him of minimizing the Holocaust on Remembrance Day by turning Moroccan Dutch people into analogous victims. In fact, Grunberg had done no such thing. He was warning about the dangerous paths of stereotyping and discriminatory political language, not claiming that Moroccan Dutch people are, quote, the new Jews facing another genocide. Yet commentators called him a traitor to the nation or to the memory of Holocaust victims, even sending him anti-Semitic death threats. Clearly, Grunberg was not playing the proper role of the Dutch Jew in a way that suited their purposes. But if the speech made Grunberg enemies, it also offered a welcome sense of solidarity to many Moroccan Dutch people who are often stereotyped as uneducated, asocial, prone to criminality, and anti-Semitic. Abdelkader Ben Ali, an esteemed Moroccan Dutch novelist, appeared on Dutch television together with Groenberg a few days later. And when asked for his reaction to Groenberg's speech, he replied that in the current political climate, he often wondered if his daughter had a secure future in the Netherlands, where he'd worked to build a life, because of the pervasive atmosphere of discrimination against Moroccan Dutch people and other minorities. He also mentioned the importance of Remembrance Day for him as a Dutch person, even though he had arrived in the Netherlands from Morocco as a young child in the 1970s, decades after the Holocaust. Its memorialization and the self-reflection it engenders is an integral part of his own sense of belonging to the Netherlands. This small but forceful example shows how Holocaust memory can be expanded in a way that illuminates other struggles against racism. When we think about the lessons of the Holocaust, there's much to learn from the reflections offered by Black theorists like Du Bois and Fanon for understanding anti-Semitism in relation to other forms of racism. But the differences are just as significant as the parallels when we consider today's moment and movements for racial justice. And by attending carefully to those differences and to those whose lives are most vulnerable, we are not relativizing the Holocaust, but rather mobilizing historical memory to forge new lines of solidarity. Thank you.
Ding sich nicht, hast du bist nicht sehr kein alter Mann. Dein Billett ist heus und du lehnst im Sies, also ist bestimmt von Gott, der Direktor von der Bahn. When the train come along, Lord, when the train come along, Lord, gonna meet you at the station. When the train come along, when the train come along, Lord, when the train comes along, Lord, gonna meet you at the station. When the train come along.
Thank you so much for that rich and illuminating lecture. First of all, can you tell us a bit about the song that we just heard?
Yes, it is from an album by Anthony Mordecai V. Russell, who is a vocalist and composer who is African-American and Jewish, and whose work combines from both of those traditions, from African-American music and different forms of Jewish music. And he performs, as you can hear, partially in Yiddish. And the reason I wanted to be able to feature that, aside from the fact that it's so powerful and beautiful, is that in my talk, I was only able to really briefly mention this very large question of whiteness and how do Jews relate to whiteness. And I think there is a perception that somehow these are mutually exclusive categories, and therefore anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism are separate kinds of issues. But in fact, not only are they sort of entangled in these ways that I described in the lecture, but also there are a lot of people who fit into both of those categories. And so, you know, people can experience both anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. So that I think is also, I think that's important to bear in mind. I think it also, you know, casts a new light on this question of solidarity. Also, I think it's important to feature these voices in particular of Jews of color in particular, especially in these you know, very polarized times and certain incidents that have happened over the last few months. There are ways in which people who are Jews of color get pushed out of both of those conversations within different communities. And so, you know, Anthony Russell wrote a really moving meditation on translating Black Lives Matter into Yiddish. That was published in Jewish Currents earlier this year. And I could share some other resources too on the resources page later.
Oh, that's wonderful. And yeah, we should also thank Anthony Russell for allowing us to play that music. Thank you so much in case you're tuning in. Okay, so this next question comes from students in the class. And some students were really confused about why the Nazis are sort of blaming or crediting Jews with Black presence and Black culture in Germany. And this is actually a phenomenon in the United States as well. So I thought it'd be great if you could comment on that.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that that's actually one place where you can see the persistence of, a very long tradition of this conspiracy theory of how the Jews as a quite small minority are thought to be somehow in charge of, a global cabal that is orchestrating things. This goes all the way back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, from the early 20th century and earlier. The idea is that because Jews are a small population, but because they supposedly have these qualities of being cunning and able to sort of outsmart others, but they don't have necessarily the human power to take over directly by force, then they make use of other populations in order to weaken them from within. And the biological metaphor is really important here in understanding kind of the racist framework for this. So that, through miscegenation, supposedly that is weakening the purity and the strength of the, quote, Aryan population. This really does carry over to present day concerns over anti-Semitism in the US too. So if you think back to the Tree of Life synagogue massacre, that was fed by the same kind of conspiracy theory. So even though it took place in a synagogue where the perpetrator knew he could find many Jews, he was motivated by a similar kind of conspiracy theory that because Jews were participating, for example, through the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, I think it's called, supporting, the rights and livelihoods of refugees and immigrants, that somehow this was also part of a conspiracy to undermine the whiteness of the United States. So I think that's a very direct kind of parallel. But that's sort of the reason, is that supposedly the Jews are too small of a group to pull it off themselves, but they're very smart, so they're able to use others.
I mean, in effect, they're also not giving African Americans credit for their achievements, right? They're like, oh, it's not really African Americans who achieved the civil rights movement. It's like the Jews orchestrating it in the background to defeat the white race. So it's...
There was a comment, I remember, that Professor Devin Narr gave a talk in the spring sometime where he said, on this issue, racists are even racist in their racism. That is to say that they don't think that people of color are smart enough to pull off such a plan, and so they attribute it to the Jews instead.
Yeah, okay. So move on to another question from the audience member. Krista asked if you can talk a bit more about multi-directional memory and what it means.
Sure, yeah. It's so it's a book by a Holocaust studies scholar. I'm trying to remember the subtitle exactly, something like Holocaust Memory in the Age of Decolonization, I think. It focuses on kind of the parallel historical emergence of Holocaust consciousness in the immediate post-World War II period, with the global movements for decolonization that were happening in the aftermath of World War II. So I mentioned, for example, the War of Algerian Independence, which takes place from 1954 to 1962. That becomes one of his central examples in that book. And what I think the really striking point that he makes there is, first of all, he's very careful not to conflate different forms of racism and oppression. And so he gives us a model for getting out of the risk of one history of oppression against another. And that's actually how he starts the book, is kind of the issue that in the United States, for example, there was a US Holocaust museum before there was any, national museum for slavery, which seems like a real issue. But he wants us to sort of avoid what he calls a competitive form of memory, where it becomes, what we could call a hierarchy of suffering, where, if the dominant culture recognizes a certain atrocity as being more important than the other, then that sort of takes away from the significance of my suffering. So what he shows instead is that actually that memory actually generates more memory. And so through these non-Jewish intellectuals who are really thinking, deeply about the Holocaust and how it's related to, previous forms of colonization, the ongoing violence that Europe was still using after World War II in order to try to maintain their empires, then that gives us sort of a different sort of lens where we can understand both of these things better. And instead of being competitively pitted, instead it's multi-directional, that we can sort of see the parallels without necessarily conflating them together.
It's really rich. Okay, that needs to go on the reading list. Okay, so Anne Levine asks, how does the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust have a place in today's critical race theory discussion and analysis? So do you see an intersection there in critical race theory and the study of the Holocaust, and how one could illuminate the other?
Yeah, I think it's, some of these are, these are very live, ongoing discussions today. I suppose I'm more knowledgeable, I think, about some of these sort of earlier linkages. But I think that, I think some of the most exciting work in Holocaust studies is really drawing these issues together in closer ways. I think that the point I was trying to kind of emphasize is that we really need to get away from this kind of bracketing of the two. I think that Holocaust studies has a lot more to learn still from, critical race theory. Sometimes I think terms such as intersectionality have been absorbed into the conversation in a way, but perhaps at the risk of losing some of their original specificities. So I think a lot of care needs to go into that discussion as well. I think we do have to sort of get beyond what I see as sometimes a kind of flippant reference to, for example, that quote from Fanon, where it's sort of like all oppressions are entangled, interlinked. Yes, but how? And so there is a difference, right, in terms of how anti-Blackness plays out in the United States today. That changes historically, it changes geographically. And so I think we have to really devote a lot of attention to those different contexts. But certainly I think that, there's a lot of fruitful conversation happening as these fields sort of come into contact with each other. Yeah,
I totally agree with you. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to study Dutch Jewry?
Sure. I am of partial Dutch background. My mother is from the Netherlands, but I grew up here in the U.S. I eventually studied for my dissertation topic. I was looking at very kind of specific dissertation-y sort of topic, looking at the reception of the Frankfurt School in the Netherlands. The Frankfurt School were these German, primarily Jewish intellectuals from early mid 20th century. It was while I was in Amsterdam for half a year working on this research is actually where I got interested in not just Dutch Jewish history, but also these contemporary issues of racism in the Netherlands. And actually I've become more and more interested in those kinds of questions lately. I think the Netherlands is an interesting case because for one thing, it has this very difficult and somewhat peculiar history for Western Europe and the Holocaust, because the Netherlands was directly occupied by the SS, and the deportation rate of Dutch Jews was higher than anywhere else in Western Europe. Nearly 75% of Dutch Jews were deported to concentration and extermination camps. And so it weighs very heavily on Dutch society in the present. But also are really problematic. And one of the things I wanted to hint at in the last section of the talk is that there's a way in which anti-Semitism, historical memory of the Holocaust, can be weaponized in ways that I think are really done often in bad faith and are actually themselves racist and even anti-Semitic. It's very common today to, for example, in soccer, which is a huge pastime of the Dutch, as you probably, many of you know, it's still very common to use anti-Semitic chants at sporting events, where one of the chants is Joden aan het gas, Jews to the gas. And this is used against Ajax, which is the Amsterdam team, which is seen, for somewhat bizarre reasons, is seen as sort of the Jewish team because originally so many Jews were in Amsterdam. So there's plenty of anti-Semitism to go around. It's an indigenous Dutch problem, and yet it often gets turned in political debates as if it's really a kind of problem that only applies to other minority communities. So Moroccan Dutch people, Black Dutch people. There's a way in which anti-Semitism almost becomes sort of essentialized into those groups, as if, for example, all Muslims are inherently anti-Semitic, as if it's almost sort of racial quality. And so I'm really interested in sort of unpacking and pushing back against a lot of those sorts of narratives.
Yeah. So one more question. What is your next research project about? Can you share with us?
Yes, I've been doing, as part of this interest in contemporary Dutch politics and society, I've begun translation from Dutch to English. I think it was already sent out in the invitation. I've got a forthcoming translation that will be published in January by Tofik Dibi, who is a former Green Left politician. He's Moroccan Dutch, second generation, practicing Muslim gay man. He also just published his first novel, and so I'm hopeful that I will be able to translate that as well. That novel has to do with social media activism and kind of the, actually I haven't read it yet, but because it just came out, but it has to do with sort of wokeness culture. It's called The Monster of Wokeness, and sort of like different ways that can unfold, and can that go too far? On the other hand, a point that he makes in a lot of his speeches is that contemporary Dutch people of color they're no longer interested in just assimilating, like as Fanon talked about, because it doesn't work, right? And so their aim is justice. The key lessons from Fanon more broadly is that these issues are not sort of questions of individual morality. These are issues of political justice, and that's where our focus needs to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. It touches a lot of student comments are actually exactly about this, like how do we respond to difference? How do we as a society learn to respond to difference differently, right? Not just as like with fear and hostility, but how do we learn to conceptualize difference in a new way? And I hope intellectuals can provide some response, but as I was telling you before the webinar started, I think novelists and artists and dreamers are the ones that really have done the best job at articulating how to celebrate difference.
Right.
So,
I think, yeah, stories are so important. And I think, there's a certain element of unlearning that has to be done. I think that's where we still really are as a society as a whole. And that takes thinkers, it takes artists, it takes dreamers, and it takes action. It takes us showing up together and showing up when we don't necessarily have something directly to benefit from it. I think that's what solidarity means.
Perfect note to end on. I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us. Please stay and continue with us. Students, a quick reminder that UW has mental health resources available to you. And students enrolled in the class, you can go over to Canvas for our Zoom debrief. Please don't forget to come back next week for Professor Daniel Schero's lecture on ideologies of racial superiority and purity. Why did Germany and Japan engage in such extreme mass murder during World War II? So do join us. Thanks again. We will now end the webinar and a YouTube link will be sent to you soon. Thanks all.